Hey guys, so basically what I tried to do for this video is essentially just go through and watch as many high rated players on DUNE as best as I can and just map out what decks they were playing just so we have a better sense of the current meta as we approach our first YCS this weekend in Brazil, which is the first one post DUNE. So essentially, of course I can't get all of the high rated 200 DB players, but I try my best and get as many as possible. And before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely go check out Card Brawlers for pre-orders for Mega Tin singles with 5% off with using code Hakuna5. So basically for this month I was able to find about 91 of the 200 highest rated players on DUNE were playing. Of course that is a little under half, so that's not really ideal. Of course I would want to have data for all 200 players, but that's just not going to be feasible. But the good news is, those ranked really high, let's say like 1 to 10 as well as even 11 to 50, I was able to actually get a pretty good chunk of them. It's just more so from the 100 to 200 that I wasn't able to find most of them. So essentially, if you look at the pie chart, we actually have more Purrely and Unchained definitely been really on the rise lately. Now, of course, this pie chart would probably look possibly different if I had data for all 200 players, which I do not have. But you know what? With what we have, Unchained, for example, has entering DUNE format. I know a lot of people probably put it at rogue level, but now it's at least tier 2. Maybe it's actually scraping tier 1 level now, especially with all the regional tops it's been getting so far. Purrely, of course, with the new support, been doing really well. Kashtira is interesting. I think technically it's probably still considered the best deck. It's just that, especially on DUNE, I'm sure a lot of the high rated players are probably sick of playing Kashtira at this point, and so especially when you have some of these newer options, let's say like Unchained, even Chimera, I'm sure they're kind of moving past Kashtira, especially with this ban list probably around the corner and probably gonna hit Kashtira quite hard. And speaking of Chimera, it's definitely been doing well at the regional level as well. Now I believe the past week it's kind of slowed down in terms of tops, but you know what, nonetheless it's shown really strong potential with this deck, and clearly high rated players on DUNE are doing well with it as well. Now of course Dragonrider always pretty good. I mean, it's just steady as it comes. Really not too surprising. Rescue Ace is another deck that's been getting more and more tops lately. I actually recently did a deck profile on my channel with Nigel, who finished top 8 at Rochester Regional with Rescue Ace, so definitely go check that out. He also shows a little bit of combo as well. Tier Elements, another deck that topped the Toronto Regionals. Shout out to Yusuf. And you know what? It's really strong, to be honest with you. Like, the type of board it can bring up is still pretty nice. And especially with this upcoming ban list, if Kashtira gets hit, if any of the Bestials get hit, or even Shifter gets hit, all of those, which at least one of those three will probably likely get hit. That's just all good news for Tier Element players. You also have something like Flunder, branded Despia, definitely slowly going down in terms of play, but still quite strong. Infernoble is another new option post DUNE in terms of its new support. I guess it hasn't done too well in terms of regional tops. It definitely has some though. So can't sleep on it, but definitely not quite there. But of course, post Age of Overlord, we'll get some additional kind of indirect support as well. We also have Labyrinth, another steady deck. Marincess, it really has a lot of Marincess enjoyers on DUNE, and a lot of them actually do quite well, and it's actually had at least a little bit of regional success so far as well. Vanquish Soul is another deck that kind of got stepped on in a way after its initial kind of hype. Definitely still has some regional tops, so still a really solid deck. And Sprite definitely is something that's really fallen off lately in the past format now as we enter DUNE. Still good, but of course there are other better options out there, and we have some decks in the other category that we'll get to in a short bit. Now if we were to focus, maybe let's say just players that were ranked from 1 to 25, sort of like the higher end, and so I was able to find 19 players, which essentially represented about 3/4, so I am missing a bit, but it's kind of interesting. At this point branded Despia and Unchained were actually the highest representation. Now of course, again, if I had data for all of the players, those missing 6 players in the top 25, this pie chart would look a little bit different, but kind of interesting that Kashtira was quite low. Of course we still have Chimera, Dragonrider, as well as Purrely and Tier Elements. Ignister is always interesting because you essentially know it's always going to be Vision, who's always really rated high with this deck regardless of whatever format you're in. And so Marincess is still kicking in there, as well as Infernoble, and also Rescue Ace still showing promise as well. So now of course, is this something that's going to be replicative of what top cut you're going to see at YCS? Probably not, but at the same time it at least shows that there's potential to do really well with these decks, particularly looking at some of these rogue options, let's say like Marincess and Ignister. If you have the right pilot, you can certainly do well in any format. Now, in terms of some of the other decks that were not really mentioned, but in that category that were still high ranked, was actually, Salamangreat is another one. It got some recent support, which, turns out is actually not that bad. I mean, Toronto Regionals, Matt actually also finished top 8 with Salamangreat. You can certainly check that deck profile on Spanko IGO's channel. Some of the older favorites, like let's say Rika, Mathmech, and Sword Soul, definitely still kicking in there. Regional top wise, I'm not sure if it's doing that well, but you know what? I think it's still a pretty decent option. Vanadium, I think, has been a very big disappointment. I think coming into this DUNE format, a lot of people thought this was just going to be one of the best decks of the format, and certainly tier 1. Now it's definitely not considered as a tier 1 and might even be starting to fall out of the tier 2 conversations. We do need a little bit more regional tops, and hopefully at the YCS people can kind of prove others wrong and show the power of Vanadium. Now Virtual World, definitely a really rogue option, but ranked pretty high on Dueling Book. Of course it is Cooperate, who's always known to pilot Virtual. Did a deck profile with them way back as well. Really cool person, and shows that obviously a very strong player and can pilot a rogue deck really well. Now, in terms of just more of an overview of the top decks on that's played on Dueling Book in general, not just the high-rated players. You do have Branded being number 1. Now, unfortunately, this is essentially encompassing both Chimera builds and the Despia builds. I can kind of technically try to sparse it out, but for now, I just try to play it safe and kept them together as the way YGO Scope identifies them. Kashtira is still played a lot. It's just of course, among the high-rated players, as you saw, perhaps a lot of them are just moving past playing Kashtira and just trying something new. Purrely still up there. Labyrinth's still up there as well. Unchained is another deck that's been seeing a lot of play on Dueling Book. Unfortunately, YGO Scope cannot actually directly identify it. I'm basically using the data by looking at some of the cards specifically that's played in Unchained. And then some of the other top 10, Rescue Ace is another deck. Again, seeing a decent amount of play. I think it's definitely starting to roll in terms of regional tops that it's collecting. So definitely need to watch out for that. Salamangreat is actually a deck that, regardless of whether it was tier 1 or rogue, it actually saw a lot of play on Dueling Book for quite some time. But in the last year and a half, I would say it definitely dropped off a lot in play. But now it's actually starting to come back now, especially with that initial hype with Soul Burning Volcano set and giving it some support. Sprite has fallen off hard. This was a deck that was, played a lot on Dueling Book for the last year now since its release, and now it's finally gotten to a point where it's just not in that top 5 play rate anymore. So definitely fallen off, but still a solid deck for sure. But of course, might even still end up getting hit on that ban list just in terms of further consistency hits. Vanadium, we've kind of talked about this, definitely kind of fallen off in terms of representation, but you know what, I do think it is still a very strong deck. It's just when it gets hit with roll, it can fold quite hard. And then of course lastly, Vanquish Soul rounding out the top 10. It is a deck that's kind of fallen off in terms of representation after sort of its initial regional hype when the set first released, but at the same time, as I mentioned, it is still pretty strong, and it's actually getting more support as well. So definitely be on the lookout for Rise in Vanquish Soul in the next few months. Anyways, that was it for a quick meta snapshot of this month and as well as September. Hopefully you found that interesting in terms of, getting a pretty decent understanding of the current meta post DUNE. I'm really excited to see these first set of YCS events. We have a lot of YCS events in September. I am going to Vancouver as well, so really look forward to seeing some of you. Anyways, a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting this channel, and well, take care guys.